Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. So let's get right into it. First, we have Hop removed as Mises Institute Senior Distinguished Fellow from PropertyAndFreedom.org, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I agree with some of Heinz Herman Hopp's anti-democracy rhetoric. As I said in the past many times, democracy is simply tyranny of majority and mob rule. But with that being said, if the Mises Institute wants to remove him for any reason, they should be able to. The Mises Institute is a private organization, and private organizations should be able to hire or fire whoever they want to. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have nationwide injunctions, a crucial check on presidential power, are not dead yet, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I guess that's good. Ultimately, if people want to view nationwide injunctions as a good thing or a bad thing, that's ultimately. It's ultimately subjective, I guess. Ultimately, all checks on power, though, are going to be subjective rather than objective. Ultimately, people in power, positions of authority, like the president, are going to justify what they want to justify, and oftentimes they have the economic and social capital to get away with pretty much whatever they want to, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have war crimes are on the menu this week, posted by Jai Porcupine, and that's a screenshot of a truth from Donald Trump, who truthed, Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. Open the fucking straight, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. Praise be to Allah, President Donald J. Trump. And yeah, that was his Easter message, I guess. That was, it's quite very, it's Donald Trump, he's very much a masturbator, pun very much intended. He always puts out bait like this, and people always take it. It's like when when the headline is Trump posts something outrageous on social media for the 1000th time, eventually you just kind of get numb to it all. It is, Trump's very much, he's always been about baiting people on social media by saying crazy stuff. I think it's interesting how he said praise be to Allah. I'm sure if Obama had tweeted that, everyone on the right would be going crazy, but since it's Trump, it's just a regular old schizo post. And yeah, ultimately, Tuesday is today, the day I'm reading this, but I think he chickened out already. As the meme goes, Trump always chickens out. So, that's very much Trump for you. He's all bark, no bite. We'll always do all these schizophrenic posts on social media, but in reality, he doesn't really do anything IRL. I guess, occasionally he'll do something like the Iran war, but regardless, it doesn't really matter because, pretty much all the Uniparty wanted the Iran war, whether they'll ultimately tell you so or not, but Trump's just the one who got into it, Also, Israel was really pushing for it, and, Israel's the one who really determines a lot of U.S. foreign policy as well, especially in regards to the Middle East. Next, we have Why Are Ancoms Like This? A Case for Left Libertarianism, posted by Single Internet 99454, and they said, disclaimer, I can't speak for all left libertarians, I explain my own beliefs as one. Despite how it might appear on the surface, the left and right libertarian positions are very similar from what I know. Right libertarians argue that interactions should be based on uncoerced consent. Left libertarians ensure that fundamental belief accepts the view as property as a form of coercion itself. Why do we believe that? The answer is simple. Leverage. A person possessing assets is an inherently stronger bargaining position than one requiring those assets. It's because of two reasons. A person possessing the assets can use them to fulfill their own need for those things. If you own homes you can rent, you can also use one to live in. Two, assets can be liquidated in case of emergency. Let me illustrate it on an example. Let's say there's a landlord and potential tenant. If the tenant isn't able to rent a house or get a mortgage due to lack of assets, they'll become homeless, so they need to find shelter as soon as possible. The landlord, on the other hand, is timed before lack of tenants lead to bankruptcy. Even if they don't have savings, they can liquidate some of the properties or shares in them to be able to stay afloat for longer. And if they can't find tenants for a while, they can liquidate or in their worst case scenario, abandon those assets completely. But then they already own a residence, so they don't have to worry about rent and probably have some cash on top of that. The landlord can wait for a better offer from the tenant. The tenant has no such luxury, allowing them to pressure the tenant into entering an unfavorable deal. Even in a perfectly free market, that applies to all potential tenants and owners, giving the owners an inherent form of authority over non-owners. And I guess I would kind of agree with all that, but ultimately, I would say the libertarian position is I would say I would agree more on the right libertarian position in terms of private property, property is kind of a firm coercion of itself. I would agree with that, but ultimately, people are going to use whatever resources they have access to at any given moment, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. That's very much how there's always going to be some person, in any given interaction, someone's going to be in a superior position to the person and the other person they're interacting with. And I think that's important to remember as well. Ultimately, people will justify whatever they will justify using using whatever resources they have, and that's ultimately how life works a lot of the time. If you have the economic or social capital to do something and you can get away with it, you can usually get away with it. It will compare to, if you don't have the economic or social capital to do something and want to do it, so oftentimes you're not going to be able to do it. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have Ohio makes it illegal to wear clothes of another sex, from legislator.ohio.gov, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's crosspost from the law subreddit, which looks like it's since been removed by the moderators of that subreddit. But regardless, personally, this is just more culture war bullshit. Ultimately, it's more just political theater than anything else. I don't think this law is going to stand up in court. And, ultimately, I think people should be able to wear whatever clothes they want to. That's very much the libertarian position. Libertarian position is, it should be against any clothes mandates whatsoever. If you want to go out in public in your birthday suit, I personally, a lot of people might think that's indecent exposure, but as long as you're not hurting anyone else and keeping to yourself, I think the libertarian position is you should be able to do so, because that's how libertarians work. As long as you're not hurting anyone else, justify doing whatever you want to justify. Personally, some people might say, well, indecent exposure, that might hurt people, scar people mentally, but ultimately, a lot of things might scar people mentally, and that's not an excuse to have the force of the state justify enforcing morality, and that's very much what any dress code is. It's an enforcement of morality. And if a private employer wants to have a dress code, I think that's fine. But, in public, I think wear whatever you want. If you want to wear nothing, I think that's would be kind of freaky and should be stigmatized. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, you shouldn't be forcing other people to wear whatever clothes or no clothes they want without their consent. Next, we have fans at World Cup risk facing troubling attacks on human rights, warns Amnesty, from NYTimes.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And personally, I don't think it's interesting how obsessed Reddit is with this World Cup. Well, the last two World Cups were held in Russia and Qatar, which have much worse human rights records than the U.S. does. But of course, Reddit has to think this World Cup is the worst in terms of human rights violations because Orange Man bad. And it just goes to show you, none of these headlines would be being published if Kamala was in power. It just goes to show you, Reddit doesn't care about anything really other than the Orange Man bad circle jerk, and it gets really tiring after a while. I personally don't really care for the Orange Man, but when you're saying Orange Man bad every day for forever, eventually it gets kind of tiring. It's like the boy who cried wolf. The first time you say Trump's Hitler, people will take it seriously, but the 10,000th time, you eventually just get numb to it all. Next we have On Absurdism, posted by RealDraw4713, and that's crosspost they made to the Absurdism subreddit. And they said, I wrote in depth on my website regarding absurdism and absurdist philosophy. My main claim is that absurdism is misaligned metaphysics, and as a result, a lot of philosophy that springs from the idea that the universe is nonsensical falls apart. You can read it in far more depth here, and link to their article on it on exitnowthe7.wordpress.com. And personally, if people want to do absurdism, I think that's fine. But I think the libertarian position is, ultimately do whatever ideology you want to, as long as you're not forcing it on anyone else. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump will leave NATO unless European leaders stop being assholes, from inews.co.uk, posted by Plasman30, and they added, I don't believe any POTUS has the authority to pull us out of a treaty we're in. Only Congress can do that. And personally, Trump, I think it's interesting how he's calling people being assholes when he's very much one of the biggest assholes in the world. That's pretty much his entire brand is being an asshole. But regardless, I think the libertarian position is, the U.S. shouldn't be in any globalist agreements like NATO, especially, but ultimately, Trump always says, oh, I'm going to pull out of NATO, but, the meme, Trump always chickens out, Trump says a lot of shit that he doesn't do, and I think that's important to remember as well. I remember everyone was bitching about Greenland earlier this year because Trump says, oh, we might take over Greenland. Well, in reality, the real regime change was happening in Iran and Venezuela, and that's very much how Trump works. He's very much good at, I would say, he's very much an asset to the ruling class in that, he's very good at making distractions of issues that aren't really there, like Greenland, for example, or leaving NATO. Ultimately, he might say we're going to leave NATO, but he's been saying that for years now, and ultimately, it's just very much gusto on his part. As I said earlier, he's very much the masturbator in chief, pun very much intended. He's always putting out bait like this to keep people engaged, and eventually you realize that that's what it is. It's bait. It's nothing more than tools to keep people engaged, and ultimately, at some point, you gotta recognize what it's bait. But ultimately, a lot of people just don't have the capability to do that. They take his bait every time, and when you fall for his bait the 1,000th time, it's like the old quote: "Fool me once, shame on me; fool me twice, shame on you. Fool me 1,000 times, maybe you do deserve to get fooled." And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have war in Iran is boosting profits for oil and defense companies as U.S. gas prices soar. U.S.-Israel war on Iran from TheGuardian.com, posted by Matty O'Clock, and they added, record profits for oil companies during a shortage, and you think they're going to do anything to fix it? How often do you see billionaires turn off the tap that's making them rich? Any of you going to start your own oil company and compete? Undercut them by just making the same profit instead of record profit? Or maybe we can all be grown-ups and admit this isn't working. And I would agree with that. Ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, why are we at... why do we have to get all our oil from the Persian Gulf? Why can't we get it from Venezuela or Alaska, or maybe make an oil well in your own backyard for all I care? Ultimately, that's very much why we gotta decentralize oil, especially. Ultimately that's what makes a lot of cars run. That's why it's so important. I think people should mostly get electric cars or hybrid vehicles these days, not because of for any environmental reason, but mostly just to decentralize how powerful the oil market is. And I think it's interesting. Elon was one of the biggest pushers of electric cars, and Reddit loved him, but then he joined the political outgroup, and suddenly he was the worst thing ever. And it just goes to show you that, if Reddit was really as against the oil companies as it seemed, that they'd be supportive of Elon. But of course, since he does stuff that they consider to be wrong, think he has to be the worst thing ever. And that just goes to show you how Reddit has no values other than in-group good, out-group bad. Elon used to be in the in-group, but then one day the TV said he was the worst thing ever and he was in the out-group, and that's very much how Reddit works. They don't have any consistent principles other than in-group good, out-group bad, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Supreme Court vacates Steve Bannon contempt of Congress charges. TIL that congressional subpoenas are just a suggestion from ABCNews.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, it just goes to show you how, ultimately, it's a two-tier justice system. Steve Bannon, he did get perp walked, and I think he did get a mugshot as well, but ultimately, he's going to end up scot-free in the end, and it just goes to show you he's in the higher tier rather than the lower tier, maybe, and it just goes to show you how the courts are essentially just there to prosecute people who are of the lower class. As George Carlin famously said, big club, you ain't in it, and that's very much how the legal system works. If you have the economic or social capital to get away with something, you can get away with it. Normally, they don't even get as far as Bannon. The other people have been issued congressional subpoenas, and they don't get nearly as charged as Bannon did. And it just goes to show you that, Bannon might be considered by the outgroup by Reddit standards, but, in reality, it's big club you ain't in it. It's all just political theater, I would say. The Supreme Court is really just a tool of the elites, as are all courts, to justify enforcing whatever they want to justify enforcing on the proles, while the elites get off scot-free. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have breaking news. Trump informs us that he took out bin Laden, not Obama, from Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross-post from the international subreddit, and that looks like a clip, I guess, of Trump saying that on MS Now, formerly MSNBC. And yeah, personally, it looks like the top comment says, I'm no fan of Trump in the video he shared. He doesn't say he killed Bin Laden. He's claiming in 2000 we should have killed Bin Laden. And yeah, it just goes to show you how Reddit, they don't really care about anything other than the narrative of Orange Man bad. Reddit always is going to find an excuse to throw Trump under the bus, even if it's not something that he actually said. And that's why, eventually you just kind of get numb to it at all. It's ultimately just that social media for you is mostly just ideological masturbation. And of course, one of it seems Reddit's biggest kink in that regard is Orange Man bad. They just jerk off to that constantly, and eventually you just kind of get numb to it all. If they want to say Orange Man bad 24/7, I'm libertarian, say whatever you want to, but eventually, your politics should go beyond that, but it doesn't seem to do that in regards to Reddit, really. Next, we have the men who wore scants in Season 1 might now be an important legal precedent for your right to wear them in Ohio, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's cross-post from the TNG subreddit, which I guess is for Star Trek The Next Generation. And yeah, personally, I think the Ohio clothes ban that says, oh, you can't wear clothes of the opposite sex, I think that's mostly just political theater and won't hold up in court, but ultimately that's very much how Reddit works. It's always whatever the current culture war is. Reddit doesn't care about anything other than the culture war. I think it's interesting. They always go after conservatives for pushing the culture war, but when the culture war is pushed from a progressive perspective, like when they paint rainbow flag crosswalks on the street, Reddit thinks it's the greatest thing ever, and ultimately it just goes to show you how, back in, I would say, the early 2010s, you had Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party, which essentially came to the same conclusion. The Occupy Wall Street said all our problems are the result of big business, and then the Tea Party said all our problems are a result of big government. When in reality, we're ruled by a consortium of big government and big business, and I think that's why they started to push all this identity politics and culture war bullshit that people can't shut up about. So people can't find any common ground and argue right at each other's throats forever. It's like that one meme of the drawing, and it's the woke SJW person fighting against the guy in the MAGA outfit, and they're in kind of like a pet box, and the businessman's looking over them, and it says, oh, this is what they need divided over culture war rather than class war. It's a lot more of a socialist thing, I would say, to class war, but it's very much true, I would say, in regards to that the elites rule over everyone else. There's gonna be inherent hierarchical systems, regardless of what the system of government is. But it's very much how they manage to keep us divided rather than allow us to find any common ground, which is why you get constant circle jerking of culture war on social media rather than any substantive debate at all, usually. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have 3-year-old suffered sexual abuse during months in immigration custody, family alleges, from PBS.org, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately the state can justify doing whatever it wants to justify, and ultimately, the Reddit Reddit wants to believe everything that, that says immigration custody is bad, so, of course they're going to believe it, but ultimately, believe whatever you want to, ultimately, the social media is very much, as I said earlier, ideological masturbation. I'm sure if this was 3-year-old suffered sexual abuse at a woke LGBTQ drag queen group, Reddit would downvote that to oblivion and say, well, that's not true. Anyone can say anything on social media, it doesn't make it true. But since this is more out-group coded than in-group coded, Reddit thinks that it's going to be true, and that's ultimately what people are going to believe, what fits their narratives, rather than actually think about everything skeptically. The family's alleging it, but that doesn't necessarily make it true. And I think that's where, as I said, if you want to believe this because it suits your narrative, that's fine. But I think it's always more important to search for the objective truth than constantly care about narratives 24/7. But that's very much what social media is. It's always putting narratives before facts. Next, we have Send Kid Rock to the Front Lines, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Fluent and Finance subreddit, and that's a meme, it's white text over red background. I'm supposed to pay my taxes while Army helicopters do a flyby at Kid Rock's house just for giggles. Get fucked. And I would agree with that. You shouldn't be paying taxes if it went, especially when a lot of it goes to the military, when they can just justify whatever bullshit they want to, including flying by Kid Rock's house, But ultimately, I think that's why taxation needs to be voluntary, and taxation as a whole, it needs to be directed, when you do pay, you should be able to earmark what your money goes to, rather than just the U.S. government being able to throw money wherever it wants to, oftentimes directly to the military. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have members of neo-Nazi active clubs joined combat events at secretive Virginia compound, far-right U.S. from TheGuardian.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, of course, Reddit's going to say the far-right's everywhere, but, of course, The Guardian, I think they ran a headline a while ago, physical fitness is a far-right thing. And, ultimately, when you say far-right and to neo-Nazi and Hitler and fascist all the time, eventually those words are going to lose all their meaning. It's like the boy who cried wolf. When you cry Nazi the first time, everyone cares. When you cry Nazi for the millionth time, no one is going to really care anymore. Next, we have Trump doubles down on war crime threats, posted by Jedi Porcupine, and that's a screenshot of a truth he made, and he truth, all civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. However, now that we have complete and total regime change where different, smarter, and less radicalized minds prevail, maybe something revolutionary wonderful can happen. Who knows? We will find out tonight. One of the most important moments in the long and complex history of the world, 47 years of extortion, corruption, and death will finally end. God bless the great people of Iran. And yeah, personally, I think this is just more gusto on Trump's part, as the meme says, Trump always chickens out, so, he'll always say something to get people's attention on social media, but in reality, he won't really do anything that the typical DC politician like Obama or Biden wouldn't. And I think that's very much important to remember as well. People always market Trump as a unique evil. And, I definitely, in some sense, would agree that, he's certainly more schizo than Obama or Biden. And, I'd say spastic as well than Obama or Biden was. But, ultimately, it's the same ruling class. Despite how he markets himself as shaking things up, maybe he posted a lot more schizo stuff on social media, but in reality, he's not too much different than his predecessor and successor, I would say. Well, at least for his first term. We don't know who his successor is for the second term is. But it'll probably still be the same establishment hack that we've got, that, even if they might market themselves anti-establishment like Trump did, they'll still be the same establishment politicians who will have the deep state really be the one running the country rather than, actually fight against it. Despite, Trump marks himself as fighting against the deep state, but in reality, he's just another deep state asset, just like the rest of them. Next, we have U.S. is using Mexico as a garbage sink, leading to toxic crises, UN expert says, from TheGuardian.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, people do need to put their trash somewhere, but I think the U.S. should probably be putting it on its own property rather than Mexico's property. But ultimately, people are going to just what they justify. If they want to throw their trash at Mexico, they have the social economic capital to get away with it. Ultimately, if people can get away with something, they usually will. Next, we have suspect in hacking of climate activists is extradited to New York, but from NewYorkTimes.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, their clients included a lobbying firm in Washington that was working for one of the world's largest oil and gas corporations with headquarters in Irving, Texas, according to the indictment. A brief prepared by Mr. Floret's legal team as he fought extradition and identified the lobbying firm as DCI Group and the company's ExxonMobil, which at the time was based in Irving, but of course the lobbyists in ExxonMobil won't suffer any consequences. And yeah, I would agree with that. Ultimately, when in any hierarchical system, the people in positions of power aren't going to hold members of their own accountable, and that's what we see time and time again when it comes to the courts. And that's why, you can't trust what the court says. I think libertarian position is, we should abolish the courts and have people enact justice as they see fit, rather than have a single state actor control what constitutes justice and what doesn't constitute justice. But, ultimately, people are going to justify what they justify regardless of whatever the legal system in place is. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I want to post an idea I wanted to share I'd made to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit as well. I said, libertarian perspectives on NAFTA. I said, so protectionist economics and terror specifically are unpopular these days, mostly thanks to the master rating-in-chief, pun very much intended, but I think it's important to remember that people have historically had issues with free trade as well. Case in point, NAFTA was always pretty unpopular among working class people because they saw it as a vehicle for outsourcing and deindustrialization, which it arguably was. I do think that was more libertarian than it was giving credit for, but I do think companies did kind of abuse it. But if a broad company wants to engage in cost measures like outsourcing, they're projected that they should have every right to do so. I do think people should try to support local economies as much as possible, but I do think truly free trade should allow them to get to your products from overseas if they feel like it. And yeah, ultimately, I do think libertarian perspective is for a purely free market, which means justify selling or buying whatever you want to, regardless of where it's from or how local it is. But ultimately, if people do want to engage in protectionist economics as well and have the ability to enforce it through the state, ultimately people are going to justify what they justify. I personally don't really care for protectionist economics. I think we need a truly free market. But, ultimately the state can justify enforcing whatever laws it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.